What do you know about the Phoenicians? Were they a seafaring people who invented the alphabet, or purveyors of cheap perfume, who made a killing in the perfume industry? Well, it turns out that both of those answers are actually true. Across the Mediterranean, the Phoenicians were known as master sailors, creating trade routes that connected distant lands from Britain to India. They were also credited with the invention of the alphabet, which helped spread literacy across the Mediterranean, and they had a big hand in making some big bucks. Yeah, that's right. The Phoenicians smelled opportunity early and often, turning their talents for sailing into a very fragrant fortune. Welcome to the channel. Today we are talking about the Phoenicians, the OG entrepreneurs. The Phoenicians were a group of ancient people who lived along the eastern Mediterranean coast, specifically in what is now Lebanon, Syria, and Israel. Their history dates back to around 1500 BCE, and they thrived for over 1,000 years, until their culture was absorbed by other civilizations, like the Greeks and the Romans. The Phoenicians were never a huge civilization. At their peak, they controlled a few city-states scattered around the Mediterranean. But what they lacked in size, they made up for in smarts and gumption. The Phoenician word for Canaanite means merchant, and they were merchants indeed. The Phoenician economy was driven by trade, and they became incredibly wealthy, selling things like purple dye, ivory and wine to the folks around the Mediterranean. Now you might be thinking, wait a minute, didn't they invent the alphabet? Yeah, they did. But before we get to that, let's talk about their work as traders, because it really laid the foundation for their cultural legacy. Phoenician traders traveled all over the Mediterranean, from the British Isles to North Africa and beyond. They even made it to the east coast of the United States, centuries before Christopher Columbus ever set foot on the continent. But how did these intrepid explorers manage to travel so far? Well, the answer lies in the Phoenician ships. Now, while the Phoenicians weren't the first people to use ships, they were among the first to make them super effective. Phoenician ships were faster and more maneuverable than those of their contemporaries. This allowed them to explore and conquer new trade routes, which ultimately helped spread their culture and language throughout the Mediterranean. In fact, the Phoenician word for ship, onga, is thought to have been the origin of the English word anchor. And who doesn't love a good etymology story? We do. That's why we made an entire video about it. Check it out in the description below. Their ships also inspired one of the most famous seafaring myths in history. According to Greek mythology, the Phoenician king Europa was sailing one day when he was abducted by the god Zeus, who was disguised as a bull. Zeus took Europa to the island of Crete, where she eventually gave birth to 3 sons. One of them, Minos, became the king of Crete and introduced many important cultural elements to the Minoan civilization, such as the worship of Zeus. So, yeah, thanks Europe. But as great as their ships were, the Phoenicians' biggest claim to fame is arguably their invention of the alphabet. Before the Phoenicians developed their alphabet, writing in the Mediterranean was done using a system called hieroglyphics. Now, hieroglyphics worked fine if you were a pharaoh or a priest, but for the average person, it was a bit of a pain. Hieroglyphics required you to memorize hundreds of symbols, which made reading and writing pretty much the exclusive domain of the elite. But then the Phoenicians came along and changed everything. The Phoenicians created an alphabet that consisted of 22 symbols, each representing a different sound. This made reading and writing much easier. And it wasn't long before the Phoenician alphabet was adapted by other cultures, such as the Greeks, the Etruscans, and the Romans. You know, those guys wouldn't have been able to write their epic poems or spread their own cultures without the Phoenicians. So, yeah, big ups to them for making literacy more accessible. The Phoenician alphabet didn't just change the course of Mediterranean history, It's still used today. With only a few tweaks, it forms the basis of our own English alphabet. Can you say Phoenician? Now, with all of these accomplishments, you'd think the Phoenicians would be remembered as heroes of the ancient world. But unfortunately, that's not the case. As I mentioned earlier, the Phoenician culture was eventually absorbed by the Greeks and the Romans. And when this happened, much of their history and culture was lost or distorted. The Greeks, for example, had a bit of an axe to grind with the Phoenicians. See, the Phoenicians were known for their purple dye, which they extracted from a type of sea snail. The Greeks coveted this dye and would often raid Phoenician ships to steal it. So naturally, when the Greeks started writing stories about the Phoenicians, they weren't exactly glowing reviews. The Greeks often portrayed the Phoenicians as greedy, materialistic people, and they even blamed them for the Trojan War. In Greek mythology, the war began when the Spartan king Menelaus's wife, Helen, was kidnapped by the Trojan prince Paris. Now Paris was Trojan, sure, but he wasn't flying solo. He had an accomplice named Enchantress, who was a Phoenician princess. According to the story, Enchantress helped Paris kidnap Helen, and then the two of them fled to Troy. And that's pretty messed up. If you ask me, it sounds like Paris did the dirty work, and Enchantress got him some backup. But somehow the blame for the whole affair fell squarely on the Phoenicians. To make matters worse, the Phoenicians were also associated with another major bummer in Greek mythology, the founding of Carthage. You see, after the Trojan War, the Greeks established colonies all over the Mediterranean, including in North Africa. One of these colonies was Carthage, which was founded by the Phoenician people. Now, Carthage went on to become a major power in the Mediterranean. But that didn't make the Greeks any happier. The Greeks and the Carthaginians competed for control of the seas, and they were downright hostile towards one another. In fact, the Greeks and the Carthaginians fought in 3 major wars: the First, Second, and Third Punic Wars. And let's just say that the Greeks weren't holding back. During the Second Punic War, the Greek general Pyrrhus of Pieria famously said, quote, "One more victory like this, and we are undone. And the last time I checked, the Carthaginians didn't even lose that war." And those hostilities weren't just limited to the battlefield either. Greek writers like Pausanias passed judgment on the Phoenicians' religion. The Phoenicians worshipped a number of gods and goddesses, many of whom were also worshipped by the Greeks and the Carthaginians. But the Phoenicians also had some unique deities, such as Melkart, who was the god of the sea and protector of sailors. Now, the Greeks saw Melkart as a mere mortal, and they accused the Phoenicians of worshipping him as a god. So yeah, the Greeks didn't exactly have a high opinion of the Phoenicians. But the Phoenicians didn't let the haters get them down. They kept doing them. Okay, so maybe the Phoenicians aren't as well known as some of their Mediterranean neighbors, but their impact on world history is undeniable. Their inventions, their culture, and their language helped shape the ancient world, and they left a lasting legacy that we're still discovering today. So next time you're sailing the high seas, or sipping a cup of coffee, take a moment to appreciate the Phoenicians and their contributions to human civilization. After all, without them, we might not have the alphabet, the concept of zero, or the number system. And isn't it amazing what a little ingenuity and a whole lot of trade can accomplish? Speaking of accomplishing things, you've just finished watching this episode. High five! Now, to keep this train of awesomeness chugging along, why don't you binge watch this playlist? It's packed with all kinds of fascinating historical tales that are guaranteed to leave you smarter and more entertained than a cat on a keyboard. Seriously, click that link and prepare to get lost in history.